I'm speaking with Amy Allen about her latest book, The End of Progress, Decolonizing the Normative Foundations of Critical Theory. Now, Amy, thank you very much for being with me today, and I was wondering if we could start by you telling us a little bit about where and when you became interested in progress and how that became the central idea through which you're interrogating postcolonial theory and critical theory in this book.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that this book project actually grew out of some earlier work that I had done on the Foucault-Habermas debate. And really what I realized in starting to work on this project is that the question of history and how to read history and whether to think about history in terms of progress or not was something that had kind of surfaced here and there in my earlier work on the Foucault-Habermas debate, but I had never really quite dealt with it head on. And so really for me, the project grew organically out of some of that earlier work where I started to think that maybe there was not quite as much compatibility or room for adopting a middle position between Foucault and Habermas as I had previously thought, if one took really seriously their differing views on how to think about history and whether we can think about it in terms of progress. So in a way, that was the main driver. I was also really interested I had been invited to give a talk at the APA, the Eastern Division of the American Philosophical Association. And this was about almost 10 years ago now, on the topic of the future of critical theory. And as I was thinking about what I wanted to say for that talk, I realized that my own view was that the future for Frankfurt School critical theory involved going back and recovering some themes from the first generation of the Frankfurt School. And I was particularly interested in dialectic of enlightenment and trying to think about the resources that text might have for contemporary debates in Frankfurt School critical theory. And the question about history and progress and regress is a really important thread in that book. And so that was another piece of how I got to thinking about and writing about progress, was trying to think about what exactly that book was trying to say about the question of progress and how that might have important lessons for contemporary Frankfurt School critical theory.
Mm-hmm. And you divide these two general schools of thought between Frankfurt School critical theory and postcolonial theory, taken, I think, somewhat generally. And I was wondering if you can say a bit about why you chose those two as emblematic, and what are they emblematic of in terms of thinking about progress and history?
Yeah, well, again, I didn't set out to write a book that was going to be about the intersection of Frankfurt School critical theory and postcolonial theory. If I had, I think I would have written it really differently. And I think if you read my book, looking for something like a structured discussion of the relationship between Frankfurt School critical theory and postcolonial theory, or perhaps even more, if you looked at it for something like what would a postcolonial critical theory look like, you're probably going to be pretty disappointed, because that's not really what I'm actually trying to do. So I think that, again, the way that it came about was sort of more organic. I was interested in thinking about the role that philosophy of history plays in kind of, let's call it post-Habermasian Frankfurt School critical theory. So Habermas's work, and then work that's been really influenced by him. And I was also interested in using dialectic of enlightenment as a kind of counterpoint to that philosophy of history, and in reading dialectic of enlightenment alongside Foucault's early work as also offering a different kind of counterpoint to that post-metaphysical and detranscendentalized but still progressive philosophy of history. So those are all kind of conceptual questions and issues that I was trying to grapple with. And I think they could be articulated, pretty much independently of the literature in postcolonial theory. But at the same time I was reading, around the same time I read Tom McCarthy's book, Race, Empire, and the Idea of Human Development, which does try to also take up this question about progress and development, and to defend notions of progress and development against a certain kind of post-colonial, post-development critical perspective. And so it was actually reading that book where I realized, well, the conceptual questions that I was thinking about also have this really important political side to them. such that, when we're talking about whether or not it makes sense to read history in terms of progress, that's a kind of general conceptual question. But in the Frankfurt School literature, what we're really talking about is whether or not it makes sense to read the history of Europe and European modernity as a story of progress or learning or sociocultural evolution or whatever term you want to use. And then it struck me that posing the question in that way and that level of specificity really requires a kind of confrontation with the post-colonial critique of progress that it seemed to me still either hadn't been had or hadn't been staged in a way that the folks who were committed to this Frankfurt School project had to come to terms with the extent to which they were invested in this kind of problematic notion of progress and the work that notion was doing for them.
I'm wondering, what was your personal sort of relationship to this idea of progress from an early stage to after writing this? I know for me, like with my training in cultural studies and media studies, I went from having a general idea, like I think most people do in North America, that progress is good, progress is development is good. It means, I don't know, more money, more technology, everything good, basically, which I think is how a lot of people generally think of it. And then, of course, as you start to read a lot of these theories that you've already started to mention, then you start to kind of flip and as soon as now when I hear progress, I think this is probably code someone is using for racism or for the destruction of the environment or for these other things. And it kind of flips somewhere in grad school or maybe undergrad, depending on experience. And I'm wondering what your experience is with that and how you think it works, I guess, for North American education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I don't remember having views about it before, let's say, I was an undergraduate. And I started reading Foucault pretty seriously as an undergraduate. So this probably, in a way, warps my experience of it. So because, I mean, maybe it's the reason that I was attracted to Foucault's work, or maybe I, kind of learned it from reading him. I'm not really sure, but he's just skeptical about, at least about the idea of reading history in terms of progress, sort of all the way through. I mean, that's one of the major lessons of particularly Foucault's early and middle period work. Mm-hmm. I don't really remember having, sort of settled views about progress before that point. But I do think you articulated well, I mean, the ways in which there's these different sides to the notion of progress. And part of what I tried to do in the book was to grapple with several of them simultaneously. So the conceptual kind of just normative concept of progress. What are we talking about when we talk about making progress or not? And then its problematic political legacy and how we might reconstruct some understanding of progress that would still allow us to make sense of the idea that our politics can be progressive, that we want to, we have something that we're trying to achieve that we think will make things better, or at least, less bad if you want to frame it negativistically, without having to buy into, the side of progress that is code for racism or white Euro-American supremacy and all those other things. I mean, I don't deal in the book really with the question about technology, which I think is a really interesting and important question, but one that I tried to separate off partly because there is a kind of separate discourse within critical theory about the question of moral and political progress. And I really wanted to focus on that. Mm-hmm. But honestly, I also thought I didn't really have the kind of expertise in the history and philosophy of science and technology that I would really want to have to say much about technological progress.
Mm-hmm. Well, that brings me to my next question, which you sort of started to talk about, which is, what do we do with this concept, or what would you like to see done with this concept of progress? Because at first, I thought when I picked up the book, I thought maybe you're going to try to get rid of it effectively and just ban it, basically. And I don't think that's the case. And so what do you say that we should, as critical thinkers, as people maybe interested in or identifying in either one of these two critical theory schools or post-colonial schools, what should we do with progress conceptually?
Right. Well, and a lot of people would say get rid of it altogether. I mean, I think there has been I've had some pushback from some audiences with respect, with this book, where people just say, like, why hang on to this concept at all? Why try to reconstruct it? I can say more about why I did in a moment, but I definitely understand and acknowledge the skepticism about it. And yes, the title of the book, The End of Progress, certainly makes it sound like I'm trying to get rid of it completely. I mean, I like that title because, first of all, it comes from a great essay by Adorno that was very much an inspiration for my approach to progress in the book, where he says progress occurs where it ends. Mm-hmm. So it's this dialectical understanding of progress where he wants to acknowledge that, it's almost obscene on his view to say that there has been any progress up to now. And for him, he has different reasons, not rooted in postcolonial theory at all, for saying that. It has mainly to do with the horror of Auschwitz, that it would be, obscene to say that progress has happened up to now. And yet he thinks that giving up on the possibility of progress is to wallow in a kind of conservative despair that Adorno associated with Heideggerianism, which for him is like the worst kind of, political association one could have. And so, and I was really, attracted to that kind of dialectical rethinking of progress, and by dialectical, negative dialectical, right? So trying to pull the concept apart. And for me, the notion that the title, The End of Progress, is supposed to evoke that, not like we're banishing the word from our critical vocabulary. It also has another meaning, which is that I was trying to think about what are the ends that the discourse of progress serves in contemporary critical theory. And the main kind of critical line of the book is to try to make the point that this notion of progress runs really deep in Habermasian and post-Habermasian critical theory. So it's not just like Habermas is a defender of the Enlightenment, and so therefore, he thinks progress is a good concept that we should hang on to. On my reading, the whole normative edifice doesn't work unless this claim about modernity as a story of historical progress is there. So it was trying to show like how much is at stake in questioning the discourse of progress for Frankfurt School critical theory, because Habermas is, one of his major projects is trying to put critical theory on a firm normative foundation. And if that foundation is progress and the notion of progress is questionable, then I think there's a serious problem there. So that's why I say we can't really rethink the notion of progress in critical theory without also thinking the understanding of normativity. And I was actually just giving a talk at Rice a couple weeks ago, and someone asked me about the title of the book and asked me whether it was supposed to be invoking or resonating with the notion of the end of history. And I said, well, not intentionally, but actually I kind of like that as a resonance because I see one of the main lines of argument of the end of progress as being directly opposed to the end of history thesis. So it's not just that it's problematic to read our history as a story of progress, particularly for European, Euro-American critical theorists, because of the way that's bound up with the ideologies of colonialism and imperialism. But it's also that the role that progress plays in critical theory does lead to a kind of end of history position in Frankfurt School critical theory. Habermas doesn't sort of acknowledge this explicitly, but Axel Honneth has kind of explicitly made this point in some of his recent work that he's willing to defend what he calls a weak end of history thesis. And I find that really problematic for critical theory, that it seems like that leads to a kind of conservatism in critical theory, a kind of status quo bias that gets in the way or blunts the radical edge of critique. So all of those things are, for me, what's going on in the title, not so much let's get rid of progress altogether. That was a long answer that probably didn't answer your original question, which was what do I want to hang on to? So I can say more about that if you like, but.
Well, yeah. Why don't you just say a little bit about what you still like, or what you want to hang on to with the idea of progress after considering all of the. You do a great job in the book, of course, in more detail of going over the sort of flaws that can be inherent. Like you talk about the fact of progress, for example. But what if anything should we hold on to with progress? What do you like about progress?
Yeah. Well, I guess in a nutshell, I would say, so I try to make a distinction in the book between two different sort of dimensions or aspects of progress and two different ways that progress seems to play into the project of critical social theory. So one aspect is sort of what I call progress as a fact, and fact there is in scare quotes because of course, you can't really talk about progress without that being some sort of normative conception. So it's not really an empirical question whether or not there's been progress. I take the term progress as a fact from Tom McCarthy's book, which I already mentioned, where he talks about the facts of global modernity. And again, he has facts in scare quotes too, I think. So, but anyway, that's where that comes from. But basically the idea of progress as a fact refers to a backward-looking conception of progress where we want to read history as a progressive story, in terms of a learning process or social evolution or something along those lines, a growth in rationality. And then I distinguish that from forward-looking claims about progress. So the idea that, we might have some sort of moral or political or normative goals that we're striving to achieve, and progress in the forward-looking sense would count as getting closer to those goals. And so I try to say, basically that as I see it in contemporary Habermasian Frankfurt School critical theory, these two ideas are really closely bound together, such that reading history as a story of progress is necessary for having a normative position that can enable us to articulate a conception of forward-looking progress. And so my kind of idea, which I take from Adorno and his notion of the end of progress, is to try to pull those two things apart, to say, not only do we not have to read history as a story of progress in order to develop a conception of critique that would enable forward-looking visions of what would count as progress in the future. But in fact, reading history as a story of progress is kind of an impediment to having a progressive critical theory in that sense. Partly for kind of conceptual reasons, I think, reading our history as a story of progress carries with it a kind of inevitable status quo bias, that it all too easily turns into a kind of instrument of self-congratulation. Look how much we've learned and how far we've come and so on. Mm-hmm. But then when you think about the question of the relationship between narratives of European modernity as a story of progress and its role in the ideologies of colonialism and imperialism, I think you could say there's a very specific kind of political problem there too that comes in when, again, we might call them Euro-American critical theorists want to read their history as a story of progress, that it's not only a status quo bias, but it maybe obscures or blinds us to the ways in which that historical legacy is a legacy of imperial domination. So I think that's the sense in which I would say that backward-looking conception of progress can actually be an impediment to having a progressive critical theory, articulating a conception of, let's say, non-domination that would really do justice to the realities of colonial racism. So what I want to hang on to is the forward-looking idea, right? The idea that, that in order to be critical theory needs to articulate some sort of vision of not a full-blown utopian conception of, the good society or whatever, but at least some vision of, what it is that we're striving to achieve, even if that's understood in a kind of minimal way as like undoing existing relations of, racist domination and other forms of domination. And that's what I want to hang on to. And I want to say, in order to accomplish that, we actually need to let go of this backward-looking reading of history as progress.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as you said, it's a political project that people have been discussing on these intellectual grounds, and in some cases taking sides, maybe Habermas or Foucault or whomever it is that they look up to or ascribe to their ideas. But I'm curious how you see this in sort of everyday speech, or, one of the things that interested me in your book originally when I picked it up was this question I was asking myself, and I think a lot of people were, about progress in relation to the last election in the U.S. And it's interesting that, Hillary Clinton, her icon or her emblem, the H with the forward moving arrow in it, was very emblematic of a sort of, at least visually, progress, right? Going forward and that kind of thing. Whereas making America great again kind of refers to going back to a past, maybe a 1950s era America or what have you. So it seemed like, if we can believe that, half or arguably the population in the U.S. at least is, on one side or the other, does this sort of mean that one side you see working towards this kind of progress in the future and one side going back to the past, and in that sense sort of rejecting progress? Or I'm curious how you see these ideas, these intellectual ideas playing out in sort of everyday politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, well, right. I finished writing this book. I guess I was doing the proofs in like the summer of 2015. So I actually like couldn't have envisioned at that point that we would be talking, that a
Yeah.
Trump presidency would have been a reality. And I really didn't mean the end of progress like in a descriptive sense at all. That was not one of the things I had in mind. So but I could see how, like, looking at it now in light of everything that's happened, it's like, oh wow, what about that?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think, yeah, it's complicated because, first of all, take the "Make America Great Again," the Trump kind of Trumpism as a phenomenon. I mean, it is true that there is a kind of regressive impulse there, to try to undo the gains of, if you want to call them progressive Democrats. I mean, I think the Democratic Party is not terribly progressive, actually, but in some sense, it's a war about what Democrats would consider progress, civil rights, and so on over the last 50 years, and that there's this kind of revanchist, regressive thing going on with Trump. But it's, in a weird way, the kind of backward-looking conception of progress is really implicated there too, because the vision that they want to get back to is one of, is one in which white supremacy and the hegemony, some sort of white cultural hegemony plays a crucial role. So the idea of, like, whether his supporters want to defend that in terms of white supremacy explicitly, or maybe they want to say, no, it's not about that. It's about, it's about the superiority of Western civilization, which some of them would say, and therefore we're not white supremacists, but we are, somehow endorsing some aspect of the Trump program. That is a claim about, that is part of the problematic backward-looking claim about progress that I'm talking about. So I think that position is complicated. It's about a vision of regress to a time when you could be unapologetic about a certain reading of history, as European history as progress, that has actually become sort of problematized. In terms of Clinton, I mean, I actually don't remember that symbol, but that's interesting. And, I mean, I think as far as I could say what her conception, or even Obama's conception of progress, and Obama talked a lot about progress, it was this very kind of cumulative, sort of learning process. Obama really liked to quote the line that the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. I mean, there is this sort of rehearsing of a kind of progressive narrative that I think I'm more skeptical of than either of them. I mean, I want to hang on to the idea that we should be trying to formulate some kind of progressive political goals without having to tie that up with a story about, of American exceptionalism or something, which I think both Obama and Clinton would endorse.
Mm-hmm. Well, to me, it was just interesting how they seem to, one side of the American political spectrum seems to embrace this idea of progress, and the other side seems to reject this idea of progress as something that's ruining America and the political system. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if that does correlate in any way to this debate between the critical theorists and the post-colonial theorists. I mean, obviously not in any explicit way, but does it in some sense in your reading mirror these conflicts?
I mean, I want to resist that a little bit just because that aligns post-colonial theory with Trump, and I don't think that, makes any sense. I mean, That's why I tried to say, like, first of all, there is a kind of problematic side to the sort of technocratic, cumulative, conception of progress that I think Clinton would defend, but also that I don't think that, that means we're on the side of Trump, right? I mean, because I think actually there's a quite strong defense of a very traditional Eurocentric understanding of progress embedded in his whole, Make America Great Again slogan. It was great when white people were in control and there was not as much of a sort of question about their hegemony or something like that. Yeah.
Well, I've also been reading some stuff about the use of sort of, I mean, and you talk about this in your book, the rejection of some groups in relation to post-structuralism, postmodernism, and in some cases post-colonialism, because it seems like complete relativism, and then we get lost in this idea of if everybody's equal, then my opinion is equal to the expert. And so we do see this kind of play out ironically, I guess. And so a lot of the people that were questioning or that were thinking about the world based on Foucault and his kind of rejection of this norm as unquestionable and universal. Those kinds of strategies have now been used to talk about global warming as possibly not happening, and to talk about all of these other things as, well, we don't quite know because everything is in the air, in my opinion, is as good or should be as good as others. And so, I'm wondering if you could talk about how you see, I mean, I know you mentioned it in your book, but how do you see this, how do you see us not accepting this complete relativism, but at the same time, not therefore going to this sort of meta-narrative or universal norm? Mm-hmm. How do we combat that on a political discourses?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, and first of all, I'll just register a little bit of skepticism about absolutely, I think you're right that there's, the idea that we live in, like, we're now living in a post-truth, environment, and even post-fact where there can be alternative facts. And, this is like an important part of the contemporary political moment. I resist the connection that some people try to draw, which I think you were just, I don't know if you were endorsing it or just mentioning it, but,
Well, that's the criticism against postmodernism.
Well, right. But then it's post-structuralism that's responsible for it. I just think like that grants a lot more power to, theory than I think it probably has,
I guess to restate, I would say that the kinds of practices that people were picking up from postmodernism, post-structuralism, of questioning and potentially rejecting this idea of an absolute truth or norm, we see that now, and that was seen as a sort of good thing because, the idea of white supremacy can be rejected because it's not this truth, it's one person's truth, and there's an alternative truth that we can compare it to. Mm-hmm. And so these kinds of things were, I don't want to use the word progressive, but they were used in a way to challenge power structures and to hopefully, create a freer society by challenging these norms. Those kinds of practices are now being used, not necessarily from the postmodernists or post-structuralists or whatever, but those ideas seem to be echoing, although of course not necessarily in any real sophisticated way, but those kinds of practices are now being used to say, well, I reject the so-called consensus on global warming, or I reject this or that because I have an alternative fact to tell you, or something like that. So there's a similarity that's eerie and that is problematic because this thing that used to be celebrated as emancipatory is now being used for a certain form of hegemony. Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely see the problem. I don't know. I mean, I don't know that I have a solution to it. I wish I did. I will say, the way that I deal with this in the book is very much on a philosophical terrain. And I'm emphasizing that because, I think that leaves open a couple of different ways that one could go in terms of what do we do with this in the realm of actual politics, right? But so part of what I try to argue in the book is that one can be non-foundationalist, or as I call it, a contextualist, in terms of thinking about how our normative principles, our first order substantive normative principles, are grounded and justified. And we can understand them as kind of what Judith Butler calls contingent foundations. And that doesn't mean collapsing into relativism at the first order level. So that doesn't mean that we have to say whenever we're engaged in some sort of normative debate with somebody, and I guess analogously, you could say the same thing about a debate, a factual, an empirical debate, a debate about truth claims. It doesn't mean we have to say, oh, I think this, but that's just what I think, and so you can never, tell someone that you think that they're wrong. It just means that when we get to the level of debating, which is something we do, in philosophy, I don't really think it happens in actual politics, very often, if at all, where we're debating like, well, how do we justify and ground the normative principles that are at play when we're engaged in political decision-making and discussion, that it's at that level that I think the contextualism comes in. So being a contextualist at that level doesn't mean that there's no such thing as truth claims. There's no such thing as normative principles. There might even be normative principles that are universal in their scope of application. It's a question about how those principles are grounded philosophically. So then, the picture is sort of like you're in a debate with somebody. On my view, it's perfectly legitimate and correct to say,
I think your view is wrong, and here are my reasons, right?
Uh-huh.
And the difference that sort of trying to interrogate the role that a certain understanding of progress plays in justifying those normative principles is intended to rule out someone saying, I think you're wrong because you're backward or insufficiently developed or immature or something like that. So it's about the status of the interlocutor and trying to avoid the entailment or the implication that some participants in the debate think that others are backward. And I think actually that does tie in some to our current political moment too. I mean, the way in which, this is obviously hotly debated as well, but the way in which one of the kind of post-election analyses is that technocrats in the Democratic Party, basically looked down upon members of the white rural working class and gave the message either explicitly or implicitly that those people are backward and not as enlightened and sophisticated as those progressive Democrats, and that produce that's not a good recipe for trying to engage in either philosophical discourse or political discourse. So the idea for me is about how do we think about how we justify our normative principles in such a way that can enable us to treat interlocutors with whom we disagree as moral equals, as moral contemporaries. And then within that context, there's lots of room for disagreement, and still being able to say that that's wrong, that's false, here are my reasons, and so on. Now, then if you say, well, what do we do when other people say, well, we have these alternative facts and we don't believe your facts? I think that's really a totally different question, one that I don't feel like I have an answer to or expertise in, right? Because it's about how politics works, which is an important question, but not one that I was trying to take on in my book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the whole thing. And I was looking at, you quote Chakrabarty's idea that he says, reason becomes elitist whenever we allow unreason and superstition to stand in for backwardsness. And so the idea that that we can't argue or that we can't reason is not necessarily, at least as far as I understand it, what you're saying. The idea is when we say that the other person or something is incapable of reasoning because they're backwards and we are more progressive than they are, or we have progressed further than they have, which I do see happening a lot in the kind of debates that I hear going on. But I want to change gears a little bit, but in a related way. Two of the main thinkers that you use in this book and that you put in dialogue with one another, we have Adorno and we have Foucault. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about what each of those two give you that makes them crucial to this project of this book.
Yeah, well, I already said a little bit about Adorno. I think the idea, the inspiration for the sort of pulling apart of the different sides of the notion of progress came from my reading of him. It's in a way a kind of creative appropriation of his work because he has, I think, something different in mind by this pulling apart or what occasions it. But it drew inspiration from him. And I had actually, not really planned to write about Foucault in this book because I had written a lot on Foucault earlier and I just kind of wanted to give it a rest, actually. But as I was working on it, maybe because, as I said, the project was partly conceived as like what's the future of critical theory, and the idea that for the Frankfurt School that means going back and recovering certain themes from the first generation. So I was really going to actually focus on Adorno. But as I was working on the project, I was also working on some pieces on Foucault for other things, things I'd been invited to write and so on, and was teaching the history of madness actually in an upper level undergraduate seminar at Dartmouth. And I just was struck by how many resonances there were between Adorno and Foucault. Particularly the dialectic of enlightenment, but also some of Adorno's other work and his philosophy of history specifically. And, I just ended up thinking that I wanted to explore that. And that's something that hasn't been explored that much in the literature. There's a few references here and there to, kind of similarities between Adorno and Foucault, but not that much in the way of sustained discussion. So, that's why I kind of brought them together in the way that I did. And then again, in terms of thinking through the postcolonial angle, these things are contested a little bit, but both Foucault and Adorno have been influential in different ways in postcolonial theory and scholarship, probably Foucault more so, but there's some interesting work on Adorno in relation to postcoloniality as well. And it struck me that that's interesting that, that's the case. Whereas, there's some discussion of Habermas's work, for example, in postcolonial theory, but mostly in a critical vein. It's not taken up as a productive framework, I think, for kind of obvious reasons. So it just sort of struck me that that was interesting, that this work has been there's been a productive intersection of Adorno and Foucault in relationship to postcolonial theory, and that was worth exploring. In terms of what they both, what I take from them, I think for Adorno, actually, I would say what I try to do is read them as having some sort of a shared method. And this does involve reading Adorno as a kind of a genealogist, which is not a standard reading of Adorno, and it's a little bit controversial, and I probably don't defend it enough in the book, although I'm doing some work now trying to extend that idea and defend it a little bit more. But the idea is a kind of shared method, critical genealogical problematizing method for thinking about history, and I kind of draw that from my reading of both of their work.
Yeah, for me, I remember the difference or the change Foucault made from an archaeology to a genealogy was really influential in how I understood things happening. How do you use genealogy? Like, is there a sort of approach on a basic level that when you're working on something you implement these ideas as well, or do you see yourself doing something different than genealogy?
I don't necessarily see myself as doing genealogy, and that might be kind of a limitation of my work for some people. I see myself as much more, interested in more methodological questions, more, kind of foundational questions about the methodology of critical theory and what role genealogy should play in that methodology. I think doing genealogy is something else entirely and would require a set of skills that I don't really have, the ability to go into an archive and actually construct a historical story from the understudied remnants of an archive. And I think that's, fascinating and important work. It's not something I've attempted to do. I do have some friends and colleagues who've done a lot of work on Foucault who've become convinced that what you should do once you've really understood Foucault properly is start doing genealogy rather than continuing to talk about it. But I can see the force of that argument, but I haven't been able to make that transition myself yet. So
but that's I was just thinking it's funny that could be, you could risk, if that is just widely accepted, you could risk this idea of progress in terms of Foucault, right?
Well, if you think there's still progress to be made in terms of understanding what he was up to, which I think there is, actually, because I think, when I started writing on Foucault in my dissertation in the 1990s, I really felt like, particularly from the critical theory side, there were just a lot of bad readings of Foucault. From the Frankfurt School side, there were a lot of criticisms of Foucault, and a lot of them were based on partial or misreadings. And so, part of my interest has been to correct those and to try to show the value that a Foucauldian approach has for the project of critical theory as that was originally understood by, the founders of the Frankfurt School approach to critical theory.
Yeah, well, you say towards the end of your book that part of your goal here is that you want to show that critical theory can and must be decolonized, but also to have given some indications of how postcolonial theory could be criticalized. I'm curious about who you picture when you're writing this work, who you picture speaking in dialogue with, and what kinds of choices you had to make when thinking about that audience.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I was envisioning primarily an audience of people working in some way committed to the project of Frankfurt School critical theory. And so that's, I guess, one reason that the main sort of thrust of the book and most of the time and attention is devoted to that first point. How can critical theory be decolonized? What does that mean? And the basic idea there is to try to figure out a way to understand the methodology of critical theory and still have it have some critical bite without it having to be grounded in this problematic story about progress. So it's a very kind of narrow, I think, and sort of specific conception of decolonization. And it may be that mean, I think that using that word and putting it in the title has gotten to me into a little bit of trouble, in the sense that people then expect something much more ambitious of the book, like that what I'm trying to give is like a decolonial critical theory or something like that. And I think that is a really important thing to do, and would be an amazing thing to do, but it wasn't what I was trying to do. I was really thinking about the idea of decolonization in this much more specific sense, and specifically with respect to the question of normative foundations. But of course, one doesn't control the audience for one's book. And so it's been read by a lot of people who are interested in and have background in postcolonial theory, decolonial theory, postcolonial studies. And that has opened up some really interesting conversations, and some things that it would have been great for me to have been able to think about before I published the book, to be honest. I mean, because my interests were so kind of specific and narrow, I sort of assemble or kind of refer to a lot of different literature in postcolonial and decolonial theory, and I don't really sort of lay out all of the differences and arguments and disagreements. I sort of treat them, I don't want to say as the same, but because there's this sort of a shared critique of progress across a large group of thinkers. And what interests me is that critique of progress. But that means that the conception of postcolonial theory is not complicated enough, actually, for an audience of people who are trained really in that field. And the suggestion that that what I have to say in the book might contribute to the criticalizing of postcolonial theory is, something I say at the very end, and rather quickly. It's not fully developed. I mean, I do think that if what I have to say about how one can be a contextualist and can have a conception of normativity that's robust without either being a foundationalist or relying on a story about progress, is true, and if one can do that without collapsing into relativism, I think that is actually potentially helpful for providing resources for how postcolonial theorists could respond to the charge of relativism. But I leave that as a kind of suggestion at the end of the book. It's not as fully developed as it perhaps should be.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it relates to the whole point of the book, which is that you can't definitively say this is the project that we must do and that will solve our problems or something. And so it can always be changed after dialogues, but the book is itself starting these kinds of dialogues, which I'm sure will lead to your next work, right? And so, I think one of the benefits of reading this is that it puts people in dialogue with each other who may not have talked about this particular issue without having read this and thought about it the way you've outlined some of these issues.
Well, yeah, and I have to say, really, I hope that's true. I mean, I do think, one way to sort of tie together some of the things I said at the beginning about, the project kind of grew out of this thinking about the future of critical theory. And as I think I say in the preface, I mean, part of my anxiety about the future of critical theory, and here I mean the Frankfurt School tradition, which is a tradition that I was trained in and I identify with in some sense, that I see myself as inheriting in the Derridian sense of inheritance, like taking up while radically transforming at the same time. So, but I do think of myself as, part of that intellectual project. And my anxiety about the future of critical theory is partly that if it doesn't figure out a way to engage more with other kinds of critical traditions, and postcolonial theory is one example, but also feminist theory and queer theory and critical philosophy of race, then I worry about the extent to which this project has a robust future, right? So to me, starting this dialogue is important to help ensure that, because I do think Frankfurt School critical theory has really interesting methodological resources that are, important and useful and fruitful and worth defending. But I feel like the notion of progress and the role that it plays in that approach is an impediment to constructing a dialogue with these other branches of small c critical theories, or, progressive theories, or whatever you want to call them. And so part of the goal really was to try to start a dialogue that I think will be productive, I hope, for both sides.
Yeah, no, I have no doubt that it is. And well, that brings me to one of my last questions, which is when you're setting out to write this, and when you're setting out to think about this in a broader sense, I'm sure that you must have some idea of where you want to go, what you want to do with it. At the same time, though, I mean, you're critical here, as a number of people are, about this utopian thinking of designing something from your specific place in history and in society, and painting a picture of a utopia that won't necessarily make sense to a future that is in a different context. So on one level, you can't make a utopian picture that you work towards, because that will repeat a lot of these issues, right? But on another level, as you mentioned, you have to have some kinds of ideas of what you want to be doing, some kinds of goals, basically. So how do you negotiate that in your head when you're thinking and working on these issues? The difference between coming up with a utopian idea, which is obviously problematic, but then making sure you have some kind of direction.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And the way that I do it in the book is to say, well, we can hold on to this possibility or the idea of progress in the future as a moral political imperative without having to ground it in some backward looking notion of progress as a fact. But we should also think about any and all claims we might make about what might count as progress as standing in need of being ongoingly problematized. And I think that's one of the lessons of reading someone like Foucault, who famously said there is no outside to power, and there's no hope of kind of achieving a point of view that would transcend all of the messy realities of power. And so therefore critique always has something more to do. It's always in the position of beginning again. So even when we think we might have made progress, we're going to have to start over and sort of figure out the ways in which whatever goal it was that we may have achieved has, become entangled in new relationships of power that we may not have been aware of. So, but I don't say much more than that, I guess. And I probably don't even say that much at the end of the book about what's left, what kind of conception of progress, forward-looking progress I want to hold on to. I mean, it's not I think some Foucauldians have read the book and said, oh, but, you want to hang on to progress in the future, and that means utopia, and that's, we can't have that. And I think it's a much more minimal conception of progress in the future. It's like local and contextual and with respect to certain goals, and something that has to be ongoingly problematized. But that's pretty much all I say about in the book. I have also written another paper that it's not included in the book, although I think I might refer to it, but I sort of was working on it mostly after I'd finished writing the book, and it's called Emancipation Without Utopia. And it came out in Hypatia, I guess, in summer of 2015. So, and there I try to develop the idea, like what would count as progress in the future more fully. And I've already kind of referred to it, but the idea is to develop what I call a negativistic understanding of progress. So what would count as progress, on my view, is in some way transforming or dismantling existing relationships of domination. So the starting point is trying to analyze existing relationships of domination and work to transform those, rather than positing some sort of positive, vision or normative goal and then, setting out to achieve that. And I think that's consistent also with Adorno's negativism, which has been really usefully discussed by Fabian Freienhagen in his recent book, Adorno's Practical Philosophy. So again, there's a kind of bridge between Adorno and Foucault there. But yeah, the idea is let's start by trying to get some kind of understanding of how domination works here and now, and the different intersecting, overlapping axes of domination that we need to try to address. And then whatever we could call progress would just count as working to ameliorate or dismantle or transform those.
Yeah, well, I mean, that sounds very Foucauldian as well. One of the things that always stuck in my head after reading, I think it was The Archaeology of Knowledge, was the idea, Foucault calls it the loosening of the embrace. So the loosening of the embrace apparently so tight of words and things. And so it's this constant sort of working towards loosening that seemingly irresistible connection of power, a hold of power. But it can feel sort of like Sisyphus continuing to do these things. My last question for you is, what keeps you motivated on a personal level?
Oh, wow. It's hard. It's especially, God, this week. What an awful week it's been.
Yeah.
to feel motivated by the possibility of progress in the current, historical moment, political climate.
But you're doing it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I guess in terms of my own work, I think I have probably it's something analogous to what I just said. I don't have some grand vision, that I'm trying to achieve or something like that. It's much more piecemeal. It's much more, working on this project that I'm in the middle of and trying to see that through and then something else. I don't think I have the kind of grand systematic, ambitions that other critical theorists may have, which is not a, criticism. It's just it's a reality of how I work. I mean, I think that's also been, sometimes I get questions about this book, that are like, you haven't talked about democracy or something like that, or like, this isn't a complete, critical social theory because you haven't done X, Y, or Z. And my response to that is, yeah, I wasn't attempting to do that. I was really trying to focus on this very specific problem and try to, work through that. I don't know if that's, maybe that just strikes me as a more realist, it's a scaled kind of ambition that makes it easier to sort of feel like I'm making progress on it. Maybe it's just how my mind works. I really don't know.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's interesting to think about, and the book itself gives, I think, people a lot of interesting views on something that on some level everybody thinks about and considers maybe unconsciously, the idea of progress. But then what you've outlined is a lot of things that I think might not have been so obvious that are now giving people a lot to think about and to come into dialogue with and to work in their own ways, whatever that may be, with their own projects towards something interesting at the very least. And I just want to thank you for taking time to talk to me today.
I really appreciate that. And yeah, interesting. I think probably my own goal for myself and the way that I read theory now is, I'm not at all convinced that, that I have the ability to get to the right answer, but hopefully I could say something interesting.
Yeah.
that would be enough, I think.
Yeah, well, and I guarantee it will spark somebody to say something that builds on it, which will build on and never, I mean, it's, as you said, it never really stops, but there are sort of these moments of either clarity or of insight that without this kind of work we wouldn't have, right?
Hopefully, yeah.
Anyway, yeah, so thank you again.
Well, thank you for your interest in my work and for your great questions. I really appreciate it.